So I'm going to focus today, and it's been a while since we've been back, since we've been together, on what's been happening in Minneapolis for almost a couple months now, and not just on the spectacle and the awful reality of the American federal government sending its paramilitary law enforcement officers into a major American city to occupy that city, to lay siege to that city, to frankly terrorize and demoralize the citizens of that city. And as we have seen, to not only arrest and brutalize, but to publicly execute both citizens and, right, the pretext for this whole operation is undocumented immigrants. I think that we could spend the whole day together speaking about that, and it would be appropriate. But I also think from the perspective of the danger to American democracy that this represents, we need to be aware that this is not just an effort to break the will of a city, to enact punishment and retribution on the citizens of a city that voted against Donald Trump. And they don't just vote against Donald Trump, they reject the vision of America that Donald Trump embraces. And in so doing, in practice, refute his brand of politics in ways that we'll get into. The MAGA movement depends for its plausibility on the idea that migration, multiracial democracy, multiculturalism, liberalism are threats to the American way of life. And Minneapolis, I think, in many ways, by dint of existing and succeeding, refutes that proposition. But I do think it's more than that still. I think this is, as I'm going to put it, a test run, a beta test of a newly emerging police state. And in saying that, I'll just note right on the left of your screen, I have an image that I find a little hard to fully come to grips with, right? These are Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and Custom and Border Patrol officials, right? Trying to enter the house. They do enter the house of a person, uh, right? I believe the person in question is actually a citizen without a judicial warrant, but armed to the hilt. And I won't go into the details here, but they have the most sophisticated weapons of urban warfare available on this planet in order to do a law enforcement operation against undocumented migrants in Minneapolis, right? There's something out of whack in this picture, right? This is not warfare if it's a immigration enforcement operation, but they are outfitted for war. And then I'll just remind you very quickly something that Pam Bondi said a couple weeks ago, right? The Attorney General said that if Minnesota would just hand over its voter rolls, this whole thing would stop. And I think that's a tell. I think that's betraying maybe a little bit more about what's going on here. And so the other image I have, and in certain respects it's a similar image. Please note, right, the similarity between the uniforms, the regalia of, right, the people entering a home without a warrant and the federal law enforcement officers entering Fulton County's election warehouse, right? And this is just a week ago, in order to seize ballots from 2020. And I want to suggest that you do a thought experiment here for a moment. Imagine you're in Minneapolis right now, and I think it's a little hard if you're not in Minneapolis to fully imagine it, but imagine that, right, you're in a relatively small city, half the size of San Francisco, and there are 4,000 to 5,000 federal law enforcement agents saturating your city. And they're not just everywhere in your city, they're pulling over cars at random. They're doing sweeps. At points, they're ramming vehicles with their vehicles. If they don't like the way you've pulled into an intersection, they're breaking your window and pulling you out of your car, right? So just put yourself in that mindset. I'm sorry, if you can, and then imagine that it's election day, right? Imagine trying to make it to the polls with this going on. And so, right, I'm beginning, I hope, to bring these images and these ideas together. That if on the first Tuesday in November of 2026, we have operations like the operation that is occurring in Minneapolis right now, occurring, let us say, also in Philadelphia and Detroit and Atlanta and Phoenix and Madison, right? And that's not a random list, obviously. I'm going to the cities where Donald Trump alleged that the 2020 election was stolen, right? And so these are the places where he alleges that illegal immigrants shipped into the country, I'm sorry, I'm using his rhetoric, by Joe Biden, by crooked Joe Biden, in order to get them to vote, in order to steal elections, right? Those are the cities that Donald Trump believes, or at least maintains, that in 2020 cost him the election, because they tilted those states in the favor of Joe Biden. And it's only the urban centers that really determine the outcome of those elections. And so, why not protect the integrity of American elections from undocumented people fraudulently voting and determining the outcome by mounting major immigrations operations right around the time those elections are supposed to occur? And then let's leave the fantasy land of Donald Trump's understanding of what's happening in elections and come back to the real world and notice, right, that it will be really, really hard for the people of those blue cities to vote if the kind of terrorism that ICE and Customs and Borders Patrol brings to bear on a city is playing out. They don't have to actually police the polling stations. They don't have to be anywhere near the polling stations. As we've seen in Minneapolis, it grinds the city to a halt when there's this level of enforcement. And so I do believe that there are multiple reasons that the action in Minneapolis transpired the way it did. I believe it's an effort by Donald Trump to re-establish some authority as his popularity is waning, to regain the initiative and the leverage that comes with having the power instruments of being the president. I believe it's an effort to mobilize his base as well, to say, look, you asked me to be here to do retribution on your behalf, and that is what I'm doing. But I also believe it is a test run. I believe it's trying to get us used to the idea that scenes like this are not abnormal or tyrannical. I believe it's trying to work out the kinks, right? It didn't go very smoothly in Minneapolis, but they're working on it. They're trying to figure out how to do it better, right? They were able to get a judicial warrant to seize the ballots from 2020. This is a proof of concept for them of how to seize federal ballots. I should say ballots in federal elections, to be perfectly clear, in 2026, right? And there is this concept that political scientists have started really using, not only in the context of Hungary or Turkey or Russia or Venezuela, but also in the United States. And one way to refer to this is electoral autocracy. People also say competitive authoritarianism. The basic concept is that you continue to have elections in a society where elections are necessary to confer legitimacy onto the ruling party and the head of state. But those elections are no longer free and fair, and it's not at all clear that they are actually determinative of the outcome, who gets to hold power. And so if, right, actions like these can disrupt the capacity of people who live in high concentrated urban areas, right? And to be as clear as possible, there is a big geographic partisan divide in this country, with urban areas being predominantly blue and exurban and rural areas being predominantly red or Republican and MAGA. So if you can make life difficult in the blue cities, you might just tilt the outcome of the election. If you have also, in a sense, accustomed the people of the United States to seeing, right, federal law enforcement officials seizing ballots on allegations, almost certainly spurious, right? Please note that this was litigated 64 times, I believe, in 2020, and not once did one of these allegations prove that there was determinative election fraud. Election fraud is incredibly rare in the United States. I have no idea which judge actually gave the warrant to seize the ballots, right? But this is something I think we're going to be determining pretty quickly because Georgia's appealing. But this is, I think, another aspect of this effort. So that's what I want to focus on today, not the details of what's happening in Minneapolis, but the much larger threat it represents to American democracy. Let me start with Minneapolis. And I just want to note for a moment a rhetorical through line in Trump's presidency and why it, I think, has the power it has. So I'm going to take you back to March 2023 and Donald Trump's address at the Conservative Political Action Committee, March of 2023, when Donald Trump is really just beginning to regain his legs as a plausible candidate for the Republican nomination in 2024. He gives this famous speech, which contains the lines, "I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. The sinister forces trying to kill America have done everything they can to stop me, to silence you, and to turn this nation into a socialist dumping ground for criminals, junkies, Marxist thugs, radicals, and dangerous refugees that no other country wants," right? Now, here is what Donald Trump posts to Truth Media in December of 2025. So 2.5 years later, right as federal troops are getting ready to descend on Minnesota. "Do the people of Minnesota really want to live in a community in which there are thousands of already convicted murderers, drug dealers, and addicts, rapists, violent released and escaped prisoners, dangerous people from foreign mental institutions and insane asylums, and other deadly criminals too dangerous to even mention?" No idea what he's referring to there. Maybe you should look at the Epstein files to get some evidence. And then, right, he pivots. He says, right, that these are people who were brought into the country by sleepy Joe Biden's horrible open borders policy. And that's where it connects to elections, right? He's not being as explicit here, but the idea that these people are being brought in deliberately by Democrats to alter the balance of power in elections, that the only way the Democrats win is by cheating, and their preferred mode of cheating is bringing in undocumented people. And then finally, the obligatory all caps declaration, "Fear not, great people of Minnesota, the day of reckoning and retribution is coming." Now, there are a couple books I like a lot that help to give some depth to the rhetorical force and the way in which this lands with certain people in our country, right? And I want to be as clear as possible. I'm assuming that you and me probably look at this and we think this is just nuts, right? In the same way that George W. Bush, when he listened to Trump's first inaugural address said, this is some crazy shit, right? And so Arlie Russell Hochschild wrote a book called Stolen Pride. Catherine Kramer, Hochschild's at UC Berkeley, Catherine Kramer at the University of Wisconsin wrote a book called The Politics of Resentment. And they both focus on rural Midwestern Appalachian people, people in Kentucky and Ohio, in Louisiana and Wisconsin and Minnesota, the people who really powered Trump to the presidency twice. And the idea that these are people who feel that this country has abandoned them. And that the sign that it's abandoned them is their protracted downward economic mobility. And the reason that it's abandoned them is that the urban liberal elites who live in the capitals of places like Minneapolis are more interested in racial justice, in LGBTQ issues, in immigrants' rights, than they are in protecting their own countrymen who are experiencing sustained vulnerability. And that maybe it's no longer possible to arrest the downward spiral of the rural and suburban working class and agricultural workers, but at least they can take their revenge on the people who've abandoned them, neglected them, and caused their decline into precariousness. And Donald Trump is the vehicle of that revenge. And by the way, he is saying to them loudly and clearly, here I come. I haven't forgotten about you, and let me enact that retribution I promised you. Let's look at what's happening in Minneapolis, right? And please note that this occurs in the context in which Donald Trump's popularity is waning. It occurs in the context in which his hold on his party appears to be in jeopardy, and Donald Trump is trying to regain the initiative, reassert power. This is the way he governs. He's not someone who persuades, he's someone who bullies. And this is going to allow him to regain that initiative. I have been doing some reading, in particular from Laura Field, the recently published book, Furious Minds, to try to get a deeper understanding, not just of the move we've just talked about. He's going to be the retribution for the white working class Christian Americans who have been neglected by the liberal elite and who want to revenge themselves against them, but also the deeper public philosophy of the Make America Great Again movement. And so I'm going to spend a minute or two unpacking for you what I'm going to call the MAGA worldview, right? And I think the fundamental assumption and worldview start from the idea that we are in the midst of a civilizational battle where the forces that we're fighting against can be represented in terms of globalization, immigration, post-traditionalism, as opposed to people merely maintaining the tradition, the religion, the gender assumptions of their parents. They very often abandon them, right? They move to the city and they become queer, or they lose their faith, or they have an interreligious or an interracial marriage, right? And that all of this, right, is being supported by liberalism and welcomed by liberal elites, but it is a threat, an existential threat. In the first instance, to the status and standing of those who deserve priority in our country, the people who have up until this point been the backbone of our country, who fought in our wars, who have been secure in their standing until very recently, white working class people, white urban, suburban and exurban and rural people. That's one threat, but the deeper threat too still is to the very institutions and culture that sustain American democracy and greatness. And so the idea that this is the civilization, a Christian, traditional, European, white civilization that has sustained the working of our institutions that is now under threat. And then, right, you move from those background assumptions to the fundamental worldview. These forces represent existential threats, not potential economic, cultural, and political advantages, right? If you live in Minneapolis, you see that actually you can embrace globalization, immigration, post-traditionalism, and flourish, but right from the perspective of the MAGA worldview, no, those are existential threats, a catastrophe for Christianity, for America, and for many Americans, but not for the corrupt elite and their allies, the weak, woke Democratic left, who are, quote, the enemies of the people because they are inviting and encouraging these forces that are so hostile to our culture, to our way of life, to our civilization. There's a fundamental political stance then that accompanies those ideas. Donald Trump captured it well in a quote he posted on social media and misattributed to Napoleon. He who saves the country does not violate any laws, right? And I think this helps to account for his hostility to Congress, to courts, the rule of law, and the institutions like the Department of Justice that are supposed to operate impartially to sustain the rule of law, because in the 21st century, in the midst of this civilizational battle, those institutions are a hindrance, not a help. If we want to prevail in a civilizational context, we need to dispense with these weak institutions that reflect an earlier time and have been superseded in this era of global civilizational battle. There is also a stance about knowledge that is involved in this politics. And the idea here is that will, power, and authority, and not expertise, deliberation, and verifiability, are what make truth and knowledge. The reason so many people believe that vaccines work is because liberal elites have managed to get themselves described as experts and imposed their controversial views on the rest of us. The reason most of the world believes that climate change is real as opposed to a hoax is similar, because the groups that are interested in transitioning to sustainable energy, who are hostile to America, which has tremendous reserves of petroleum, that those groups aren't right. They aren't making better arguments. They've just become more powerful. And right now, Donald Trump and his administration are trying to fight power with power. And they're doing so by controlling discourse, right? Putting Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of the CDC and the Department of Health. And we could keep going, right? You know, shutting down curricula in schools or exhibits in museums that challenge their worldview. If you produce deeds, images, spectacles, and discourse, you can produce new realities and new truths. And that's especially the case when we live in a fundamentally altered media system and public sphere, right? Where when Donald Trump says something and tweets it or puts it on social media, it's very quickly picked up by the entire right-wing media ecosystem. And in that system, it's an echo chamber, right? You don't hear any counter views, any alternative perspectives. So many of us had hoped, maybe still do hope, and I don't think it's a vain hope, but I think it's turned out in the first year of the Trump administration to be less solid than we had hoped. We had hoped that the American legal system would be a brake on competitive authoritarianism in the United States, that we would be able, when the Trump administration violated the law or violated central norms, to go to court and the courts would stop it. And it turns out, right, that the Supreme Court is perhaps more partisan, more ideological, more sympathetic to expanded administrative and in particular executive power than we had realized. And also, it turns out it's easier to break the Department of Justice, I think, than many people realize. The Department of Justice is fully broken and corrupted at this point. It has become Donald Trump's personal law firm. And by the way, it is the biggest and the most powerful and the best funded law firm in the United States. And it's now being used to do election interference, right? And so the question of to what degree can we fight the fight for democracy inside the institutions that we like to describe as the core democratic institutions of our society, using the Constitution, using the courts, using elections, it's not as clear cut in 2026 as it was in 2024. That leaves us, right, the media, the courts, congressional hearings, the public, and resistance, demonstrations, mobilization, the effort to move outside the institutions and to re-establish some kind of countervailing power in 2026. That's where the struggle is at this point. So with that background, I now want to jump into a little bit more on the actual effort to build something akin to a police state in order to transition the United States into competitive authoritarianism. I'm going to start with the legal groundwork. And I'm going to suggest that immigration has primarily been a pretext. It's not the real thing that Donald Trump and his administration are after in Minneapolis. It is a good excuse to go into Minneapolis full force. I will show you some pictures in a few minutes, but if you look at what's happening in Minneapolis, and if you remember the pretext, right, that there's Somali fraud occurring in Minneapolis. And note, first of all, it's not exclusively Somali, and the people who are involved in it, who are of Somali origin, are mainly citizens, right? But more importantly, bringing 4,000 to 5,000 law enforcement officers to sweep the streets, to do roving sweeps for people who happen to be black or brown, that is not an anti-fraud operation. I want to point now to a memorandum, and there's just been so much happening in our politics over the last year that it's really hard to keep track of it all. But I want to highlight in particular what's called National Security Presidential Memorandum Number 7, issued on September 25th, 2025. And if you're like me, that date may not mean very much. But if I remind you, that's about 10 days after Charlie Kirk was assassinated, right? The right-wing podcaster and commentator who was giving a talk at the University of Utah and gunned down tragically, right? Nobody should suffer that fate. But at that moment, right, that there's another, I'm sorry, pretext, right? The sense that, well, Donald Trump has been twice targeted for assassination. Now, Charlie Kirk has been assassinated. There is, as the title of the memorandum suggests, right, this is taken from the White House website. Please note, right, in order to get access to this, I had to give them my email address. They're not making public documents anonymously available anymore. Right, the title is National Security Presidential Memorandum on Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. Now, I'm going to assume this is familiar, but if you look at who does political violence in the United States and you divide it ideologically on a left-right spectrum, there's 6 times as much violence from the right than there is from the left. But please note, I'm going to focus now on the definition of domestic terrorism that is used in the preamble to this document, and I've got it in quotes here, right? That people who should be targeted for investigation as domestic terrorists by the FBI, by the Department of Justice, by the national security agencies of the United States, quote, display anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity. They support the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. And I just want you to notice how slippery this document is, right? It is equating people who want to overthrow the US government with people who criticize Christianity or capitalism. It refers to extremism on migration, race, and gender without defining what extremism means, right? And hostility to traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. What exactly are traditional American views on those topics? I want to remind you now that when Renee Good was shot down by Jonathan Ross in Minneapolis, within an hour, right, high level officials in this administration were describing her as a domestic terrorist. And I want to note, right, by this definition, she probably is a domestic terrorist, not because she wants to overthrow the US government, but because she's a lesbian, right? Because she shows hostility towards traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, extremism on gender, right? And so this is laying the groundwork, right? Trying to get US law enforcement agencies to focus on people for, right, differential scrutiny and potential prosecution on the basis of the content of their ideas or ideology, right? This is deeply in tension with the First Amendment, and yet it is, right, a national security presidential memorandum that is being used by the federal government to determine where it's going to direct its law enforcement and prosecutorial resources. So I want to continue in looking at the way in which our current administration is creating the legal scaffolding for a police state. I'm going to start with the idea that the Department of Homeland Security has asserted in an unpublished memorandum. It came to light a few weeks ago because of a whistleblower, right? That its officers do not need warrants to forcibly enter the homes of suspects. And just in case it's not clear, right? The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution protects us against unreasonable searches and seizures of our property and our homes, right? The Fifth Amendment entitles us to due process under the law. The 14th Amendment reiterates that and connects it to, right, a dogma of equal standing within the law. And I just want to be as clear as possible. The way in which this has been interpreted, really since the very beginning of constitutional law doctrine surrounding this, is to mean that when a prosecutor suspects that somebody is a criminal and that they need to enter their home in order to prevent a crime or to accumulate evidence to charge them in that crime, they need to go in front of an independent and impartial authority who understands the constitutional values at stake, the integrity of the home and privacy in the home, the sanctuary, and the role that having an expectation of privacy in the home plays in our ability to maintain ourselves as a free society. This is, right, being violated and rejected by this administration. And in so doing, they're not only rejecting the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment and all of the precedent and legal cases and norms surrounding them, they're frankly rejecting the common law tradition going all the way back to the Magna Carta, right? And so again, right, the idea that immigration is a pretext because these people aren't documented, they don't get these rights. And please note, that's not what the Constitution says. The Constitution protects persons, not only citizens. The idea that the criteria for warrantless arrest have been dramatically expanded, I think, is very much akin to the idea that you can use administrative as opposed to judicial warrants to enter homes. Then a third idea that I think, again, really needs highlighting. When, right, Jonathan Ross killed Renee Good, this language was repeated when Alex Preddy was shot down as well. the idea that federal law enforcement officers, DHS officers, have, quote, absolute immunity. That's a quote from J.D. Vance, right? J.D. Vance went to Yale Law School, the top law school in the country, and he knows that there is no doctrine of absolute immunity in the United States. There is at best qualified immunity for federal law enforcement officers against state prosecution, but I don't think this is a mistake. I don't think this is a slip. There's a much more elaborate statement that Stephen Miller made, and Pam Bondi and others have made similar statements. They're in essence saying to the ICE officials, to the Customs and Border Patrol officials, you don't have to worry about prosecution. And please note, right, when that is paired with their disguising their identity, right, using face masks, removing their regalia, their badges, not wearing body cameras, it creates a sense of immunity and unaccountability. And then you add, right, that the president, after the Trump v. US decision, right, in which, right, the Supreme Court gave presidents immunity from criminal prosecution in a broad swath of their action. And you couple that, right, with the fact that Donald Trump is incredibly generous in handing out pardons to anybody who he thinks is on his side or who pays him enough money. And there is a sense in which what Vance and Miller are saying is right, which is, given how broken the Department of Justice is, right, given how apt the president is to pardon anybody he likes, you really don't have to worry about accountability. Go ahead and use excessive force. Go ahead and use pepper spray and flash grenades, and go ahead and shoot a few people if you have to, right? You're not going to get in trouble for violating the law as long as you work for us. The contempt that they've shown for lower court holdings, right? A recent decision found that in Minneapolis there were at least 60 cases in 30 days where the administration defied court holdings, right? Court orders. And what it conveys when your government blatantly and obviously lies to you. It's not just enough, right, that Pam Bondi rushes to say that Renee Good is a domestic terrorist, or that we have Kristi Noem saying that Alex Preddy was there to be an assassin and do maximum damage, right? They know that there are multiple videos of the events and that those videos are not going to hold up. They're not going to show what they want them to show. They don't care, right? They, in a sense, want you to know that they're lying to your face. Think about what's going on in Russia right now, right? Which is to say, 1 million casualties as we near the 4th year anniversary of the Ukraine war. And it's still illegal. You still go to jail in Russia for calling the right invasion of Ukraine a war. So I think that's the right reference here, right? Your government has the power to intimidate you out of repeating what your eyes actually see. And the idea that, right, that government has, it appears, falsified images, right? Multiple cases now where they're using artificial intelligence or misdescribing documents in order to create the impression that they're more effective or more intimidating, or that the people they're going after are more dangerous than they actually are, right? Again, this is the kind of propaganda you expect out of an autocracy, not out of democracy in America. Second major aspect of this, I'll speed up because I want to make it all the way to the end of what I have to say to you today. The idea that the one big beautiful bill, right? Remember the signature piece of legislation of Trump's second administration so far, allocates $170 billion to the Department of Homeland Security, especially for immigration enforcement. And I just want you to notice, I won't go into all of the details here, but if, like me, Your mind kind of boggles when you hear $170 billion. Exactly how much is that? Well, let me express it this way. If the Department of Homeland Security were a military, it would be the third best funded military in the world. It would have more money than every military in the world except for the United States and China, right? And so that gives you a sense of the scale. There have been, since that bill was passed, 12,000 new ICE officers hired, right? 4 to 5,000 of them, well, total, are on the streets of Minneapolis. That means there are another 7,000 to go elsewhere and do their mischief in other cities. And please note that the hiring binge is not over and that the recruiting material uses thinly veiled neo-fascist and racist memes and language and slogans, right? They are recruiting people for their thuggishness, for their racism, for their violence, and then they are letting them loose on the streets of a diverse, liberal American city and promising them unqualified immunity, and they have the resources to provide them with the best armaments and best equipment available to the American military. And by the way, this is what's caught up in Congress right now. This is what the shutdown of DHS is all about. There's another $64 billion in the 2026 budget for DHS, right? This is a huge expansion, and I don't think we should have any illusions about this. This is the construction in plain sight of the president's paramilitary force under the auspices and pretext of immigration enforcement. And it is well advanced already, right? This is no longer, we should be worried about this. It is actually happening. So, third aspect of this, and another aspect of the big beautiful bill, it contained about $18 billion for surveillance technology to be employed. Again, the pretext is for immigration enforcement, but please note, not exclusively on the border. There is some stuff on the border, but a lot of stuff for the interior, and using cutting edge artificial intelligence and machine learning technology to do facial recognition anywhere and everywhere in the United States, to do biometric recognition, right? Not just your face, but your DNA, to do license plate tracing. And please note, this is the experience that people in Minneapolis are having, which is they go to a rally, a federal law enforcement officer snaps a picture of them on their phone, right? And that picture is uploaded to a federal database that uses facial recognition technology. And 3 days later, there are law enforcement officers turning up at their home with an administrative warrant because they want to interview them on suspicion of domestic terrorism, right? Imagine the chilling effect, or to put it differently, imagine the courage of the people of Minneapolis who are now fully aware that the federal government wants to harass and maybe investigate. And please note, if they actually investigate them, the Department of Justice is increasingly Donald Trump's personal law firm. It has vast resources. It can very quickly bankrupt you if you decide to fight and defend yourself against its investigation, right? And so this is part of the effort to make the playing field highly tilted in favor of one party against another, make it very difficult to do what seems to be the most effective and important thing to do in 2026, which is to demonstrate, to engage in civil resistance, to engage in mobilization to preserve democracy. I'll be quick about this too, but I just want you to notice that the technology that they have is new technology, that it's already being deployed in the form of license plate readers, in the form of handheld cameras. These are real pictures of things that are happening in Minneapolis and elsewhere, that the technology very quickly, right, extracts your identity from facial recognition, puts you into a database, that they are intercepting cell phone signals to be able to monitor and spy on the people engaged in demonstrations. This is in, I think, ordinary imagination, kind of James Bond stuff, but it is really being deployed by the federal government against law-abiding citizens exercising their constitutional rights. They have technology from Israel that allows them to basically crack almost all of the encryption on a cell phone. They are very readily reading the license plates of vehicles, right? So you put all of this together, and it's not just this, right? This is a diagram that the Financial Times has assembled, and they've assembled it using a team of scholars who study autocracy and autocratic takeovers in democratic societies. And what they've done is to create a scale, right? Where 0 is the moment the autocratic leader takes over, and 30 is the complete collapse of democracy and its replacement by autocracy, right? And please note, Turkey is the closest to that. Russia, Venezuela, Hungary, pretty damn close, but not as far as Turkey. And it includes things like, do elections go off with integrity? Does the judiciary maintain its independence? Is the media free? Will civil service bureaucrats maintain their autonomy? Is there toleration and encouragement of political rights, or instead is there state force used against civilians, right? And are political opponents targeted? Are civil liberties and human rights respected or not? You put all this together, you get an objective scale, and then you can measure, right? This is years. Year 0, year 1, year 2. Then you can see how quickly the autocratic takeover is, right, unfurled, how quickly democracy erodes. And this is where I think it's extremely important to recognize the velocity with which the Trump administration has used executive power to attack democratic norms and institutions. It is moving faster than Erdogan moved in Turkey, than Orban moved in Hungary, than Putin moved in Russia, right? Than Chavez moved in Venezuela, right? And in this regards, right, I think we just need to recognize it is happening here now. It may not yet be accomplished. It is not yet successful, but it is on its way, right? And so then to make this a little bit more complicated, and I do think this is where I begin now to pivot to a little bit of better news, right? This is from an organization called Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM for short, and Nate Silver took some of their data and created some, I think, very helpful charts out of it. This chart, which I know is impossible to make out, let me see if I can explain it to you, puts two different developments on two different axes. The further up you go this diagram, the more mobilization in society and state there is for autocracy, right? So North Korea has the highest autocratic mobilization score. Cuba is very high. China's reasonably high. Russia's quite high. Turkey's very high, right? Then down here, you go across the horizontal axis, is a mobilization for democracy score, right? And so what are the countries that are most mobilized for democracy? Interestingly, Ghana, Taiwan, Poland, Greece, Colombia, Ethiopia, right? And then one more thing to see. There are little red crosses here, right? These are the countries that are comparable to the United States, that are well-developed, long-standing democracies. And in that group of countries, the United States is highest in the combined score. People mobilize for democracy, but people also mobilize for autocracy. We don't just have a federal government mobilized for autocracy. We have a lot of people mobilized to stand up and oppose that, right? And that's, I think, the more complete and complex picture. I think bringing in the temporal dimension here helps as well. So the blue line is mobilization for autocracy going back to 1900 and forward to 2025, right? The red line, mobilization for democracy, same time frame in the United States, right? And please note, from 1900 to 2016, not a lot, or 2015, not a lot of mobilization for autocracy in the United States. Basically, almost always very low. In 2016, that changes, right? And please note, it takes off like a rocket in 2016 through 2020. It came down a little bit. It seems like it might be going back up again. And we know why this is, right? It's in 2016 that Donald Trump takes over the helm of the Republican Party. And a central finding in contemporary political science is that, generally speaking, members of a party, people who identify with that party, go where the leader of the party takes them, right? Donald Trump goes in an autocratic direction. A lot of Republican rank and file voters follow him. But here's the second dimension, right? Democracy, support for and mobilization for democracy in the United States has always been very high, and higher by far than support for autocracy. Note the way it goes up during the Cold War when we define ourselves against the Soviet Union, but then note also the way it goes up, mirror image, in 2016. As the Republican Party, under the leadership of Donald Trump, is becoming more and more a pro-autocracy party, the Democratic Party defines itself, frankly, against Donald Trump. A more generous way to express this would be to say that if you live in a society where you take democracy for granted, right, you can be pretty laid back, pretty chill about democracy. It works. We don't need to defend it. But if all of a sudden one of your two main parties is led by a man who wants to dismantle or attack these institutions if he can, then you better mobilize. And the American people are mobilizing. So with that framework in mind, let's return to Minneapolis. Well, I guess I got one more thing I want to do first, and I'll be very quick. This is a diagram from Yasha Mounk, and I'm not going to be able to fully explain it today, but I want to note that for the most part, what we mean by democracy is what Mounk calls liberal democracy, right? And so that means not that liberals are in charge, but that there are protections of liberties, right? The 19th century sense of liberal. Protection of liberties and rights for individuals and minorities against the majority. It doesn't matter that the majority is Christian. It can't suppress the rights of religious minorities. It doesn't matter that the majority is white. It can't prevent African Americans or Latinos from voting or exercising their rights. And so this tends to be what we value in democracy, but there are other combinations, right? You can have undemocratic liberalism. Mounk thinks in many ways the United States has been governed in this way under Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama and maybe Joe Biden as well, right? That these have been leaders who were democratically elected in free and fair elections, but once in power, they've not listened to the people as much as their democratic credentials suggest they should, right? And the result has been an increasing backlash, and it's not just in the United States, right? The European Union is another big example, and it's leading to illiberal democracy, right? Leaders who are elected in a democratic society who said, I represent the people and I'm going to do what the people want me to do. And if they're not liberal, I'm going to go in the illiberal direction, right? And that is, I think we just have to get our heads around it. The ascendant movement in the democratic world in the 21st century. That might be putting it too strongly, but I think one thing we have to be clear-eyed about is that illiberal democracy is a constant, viable political alternative to liberal democracy in the 21st century. Eventually, we're going to have to figure out how to defend liberal democracy. In moments like this, it seems the most imperative thing is to figure out how to defend ourselves against illiberal, competitive, authoritarian leaders like Donald Trump And that's where I want to conclude today. The idea that what is happening in Minneapolis, right, is being documented, that we're seeing with our own eyes what's happening with the public execution, the state murder of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. That this allows us to recognize, at least many of us, those of us who don't live in the right-wing media ecosystem where alternative images and alternative videos are being played on reels to try to make their viewers believe that Renee Good really was trying to run over Jonathan Ross, that Alex Preddy really was a thug who came there to kill people and not a relatively peaceful person trying to help somebody up who has just been pushed down by an ICE officer. But these images, I think, are circulating, and you combine them with the images of what's happening overall in Minneapolis. This looks like a war zone. It does not look like a law enforcement operation. And then the additional images, right? The images of young children being taken by the federal government, of people being pinned to the ground and sprayed at close range with pepper spray in ways that the manufacturer of the spray says don't do that, and there's no reason, right? The images that look like they could be from the dirty wars in Argentina, but those are our government employees sinisterly patrolling the streets of an American city. These images are shifting sympathy and respect to the victims of state violence in Minneapolis. There's a famous observation, Daniel Allen at Harvard, about the civil rights movement. She says, as much as the soaring rhetoric of Martin Luther King Jr. or the tightly reasoned legal arguments of Thurgood Marshall moved the needle, even more so was the image of Ruby Bridges, right? The 6-year-old African-American girl desegregating a school in Mississippi, and the parents of the children in that school hurling racial epithets and spitting at a 6-year-old girl. The images that circulated on the cover of Life magazine and the newspapers all over the country provided a map to power. Let us see, right? This is what hate and racism and brutality and lawlessness look like. And I think, frankly, the ICE occupation of Minneapolis is producing these images and having the same effect. It's turning the tide of public opinion against the Trump administration. So I'm going to say very quickly, right? The right to bear phones and witness, right? That were it not for the fact that the brave people of Minneapolis are coming out in the ice cold to document this, we would not know what happened to Renee Good and to Alex Preddy. And that there is, in essence, a race going on right now. The administration is really trying to adapt the tools of competitive authoritarianism to the American context. It's not easy. We're not like the people of Turkey or Russia, new to democracy. We're not giving up readily, but they are working at it and they're getting better, right? And don't, I think, doubt that they will continue to get better. They will learn from Minneapolis. But the other party in the race is us, the American people, right? And we are evolving our tools and strategies of resistance in admittedly a fractured public sphere, right? And so the images of Good and Preddy that get out don't get everywhere, but they seem to be turning public opinion. And here, one more image from the Financial Times, right? Metrics, while in terms of executive action, there's been a race to autocracy in the United States. In terms of other institutions, right? In terms of the judiciary and the media and people in civil society resisting, the US is so far doing better than the other countries that have succumbed to autocracy. This is being reflected, right, in the polling on this. I think it's staggering to notice that what last year was a radical lefty idea, abolish ICE, today is supported by a plurality of Americans, that a clear majority of Americans think that ICE is at fault in the shootings in Minneapolis, that ICE is making our cities less safe, right? Donald Trump's approval is sinking like a stone, right? And the strong disapproval is up to 46%, almost double the strong approval. And the disapproval of his immigration handling, right? The handling of the immigration issue, which was, right, one of his strong issues. People are still happy with him on the border. But this is really turning opinion against Donald Trump. And by the way, right, this matters because we are still a democracy. We are still going to have elections in 2026. And the Trump coalition is falling apart, right? He's losing the non-white voters that were essential to his victory. He's losing the young voters who turned in his favor in 2024, turning strongly against him in 2025, 2026. And we see it in places like Virginia. We see it in deep red Texas congressional districts that have special elections and elect Democrats, right? And I do think this is beginning to play out. The reason the Epstein files have been published, the reason Donald Trump is being condemned by his own party for publishing a racist, right, meme on his account a couple days ago, those indicate that the Republican Party is not as intimidated. Congressional Republicans are not as cowed by Donald Trump at the beginning of 2026 as they were for most of the last year. But I want to be as clear as possible, right? These important changes in public opinion only matter if we have free and fair elections. And I don't think we should view what's happening in Minneapolis, as outrageous as it is, as simply about punishing a liberal city or using totally unjustified asymmetrical force for immigration enforcement. It is about test running an autocratic playbook that is designed, or at least it is hoped, that it will be ready to go by the first Tuesday in November to disrupt elections across the country. That is what we need to be prepared for and vigilant in resisting. Let me stop there. I know I took my full hour and a few minutes, but I want to hear your thoughts, your questions. I can't see you, but I can hear you. So Roxana, are you able to start us out with the questions? Who has a question?
Anybody have a question?
Roxana?
Yes.
David, this is Teo. Do you see us getting, will there be a major civil disturbance before I kick the bucket?
Before
Did you hear that?
Major, before you,
Before he kicks the bucket, he's saying.
Yeah, Teo, so you're asking about the next 40, 50 years, huh? I'm major civil disturbance. I'm not quite sure I've got any good way to predict that. I get asked every now and then about civil war. I don't think we're on the brink of a civil war. And I want to be as clear as possible. I don't think civil war works in the 21st century because the government is too damn strong, right? We don't have enough arms to resist the government. We're not going to have a meaningful civil war. And by the way, most of the revolutions that have happened in the second half of the 20th century, in the early parts of the 21st century, have been nonviolent revolutions. And so I do think we're in the midst, it's already happening, of a protracted struggle between repression and resistance. That's what's happening in Minneapolis. And by the way, it's not just Minneapolis. It's happening in Maine. It's happening in Chicago. It's happening in Los Angeles. It's happening in Washington, D.C., right? And it's coming to another major American city near you soon, right? And so I think, in a sense, the answer to your question is yes, it's happening now, but it's not leading to civil war. It's not leading to the violent disruption of American society. It is a struggle between people who are peacefully assembling in order to exercise their constitutional rights. And let me be as clear as possible. Some of them cross the line, right? Some of them do things that they shouldn't do. But I do think in light of the degree of violence and repression, which is designed to be escalatory and provoking, that the federal law enforcement agents are bringing to bear in Minneapolis, it's remarkable how disciplined, how constrained, how peaceful the people of Minneapolis are being. And by the way, there are people in San Francisco and New York and all over the country who are preparing for ICE to come to us and to do well and be as disciplined as the people of Minneapolis have been. I hope you're well, Teo. I got your email about making my slides more simple. You probably know, I think it's Montaigne who signed a letter and then put a PS and said, I'm sorry that this letter is so long. I didn't have enough time to make it shorter. I do know my slides are crowded. I'll try to do better, but I have a lot to share with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Teo. Anything you want to follow up on?
It is so scary what we're heading into, and we could easily follow a route like Hungary or Venezuela and have disparate parts of society.
Yeah, and I don't disagree, but I do think, right, that mobilization for democracy outnumbers mobilization for autocracy in this country, 4-1. We got to bear that in mind. Yes, Donald Trump and his administration have the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, but we have the numbers. And by the way, push comes to shove, Donald Trump is losing the support of his own party. 1 in 6 people who voted for him regret voting for him. Some of that is because inflation hasn't come down fast enough or jobs have not gone up fast enough, but some of it is because they find him too divisive, too lawless, and they don't like when our government tries to repress its own people for no good reason. So bear in mind, right, that the numbers and, in a sense, the truth, as well as justice and democracy, are on our side. And those are powerful assets to have in this kind of struggle. Thank you, Teo.
Any other questions? No? Okay, I think that's it, David.
Okay, Roxana. I was telling Roxana before we started that especially now I'm missing San Francisco, right? It's -6 degrees last night. I certainly look forward to being back there and seeing you in person, having more of an in-person interaction, but I'm glad we got to do this afternoon. Be well, everyone. Take care. Chins up. It's good to process this stuff together. We'll keep going, and I'll be there in person next time I get there. Thanks, Roxana. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David. We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.